Okay, this is the third video for Module 6. We just finished talking about social loafing. Let's move on and discuss deindividuation. I have a lozenge in my mouth in case that's audible. Okay, so let me start my timer. So when we're in a group, we can sometimes become less aware of ourselves and pay less attention to our normal standards of personal conduct. We can do things when we're in a group that we wouldn't otherwise do. So this is deindividuation, and it's more likely to happen when you're feeling quite anonymous in a group, when there's physiological arousal, that is heart rate up, blood pressure up, and when responsibility for consequences is not clear, right? So here's the Proud Boys marching during a protest in Washington. Note that they're all dressed similarly. They've got sunglasses, hats, and masks. So they're feeling quite anonymous, right? And so they're more, and presumably they're also having high arousal, heart rates, and blood pressure as they're marching around and chanting their hateful chants. So this is a scenario where people are more likely to do stuff that they wouldn't otherwise do. So back in the 1960s, Stoner found that groups often make riskier decisions than individuals do. And he called this the risky shift effect, right? So when you're in a group and, tempers are high and feeling anonymous, people tend to do riskier stuff. So this helps explain why people in a group might try something dangerous, but none of them would have tried alone. We have a graphic and appalling example, right, with the mob that tried to overthrow the government on January 6th, 2021. Presumably, none of these people would have behaved this way if they were there by themselves, right? There's something powerful about being in a group. It makes people do riskier stuff. So that can happen. The opposite can happen too. Sometimes groups can get more cautious instead of more risk-taking. It all depends on what the initial attitudes of the group are. So if most people in the group start out a little cautious, then the group becomes even more cautious. If they start out wanting to take a little risk, then they end up making bigger risky decisions as a group. So this is called group polarization, where the group gets pulled to one end or another, right? As a result of group discussion, the dominant position gets more extreme. Okay, so group discussion strengthens the dominant position, makes it stronger, more extreme. Let's take a mundane example. You go to a movie with your friends, and while you're watching it, you're thinking, this isn't going to win any Oscars. It's not super, but it's okay. Right? It's not awful, but it's not terrific. It's good. Afterwards, sitting around talking about the movie with your friends, people start mentioning all the ways it wasn't great. Everyone had a mildly negative kind of attitude about it. But before long, as a result of discussion, you've moved to a more extreme consensus, which is that you hated it, that it sucked, right? So people can become more extreme as a result of group discussion. So if the group's average opinion starts out mildly negative, it becomes more strongly negative after group discussion. If the average opinion starts out mildly positive, it can become more positive after group discussion. Okay, group polarization is this phenomenon where group consensus is made more extreme than any one individual opinion. Groupthink is an emphasis on group unanimity at the expense of critical thinking. So groupthink is where the group is very intent on everybody agreeing, right? And to the point where they lose their capacity to evaluate the situation, the issue, the project objectively. And as a result, groups can make really bad decisions when they're focused on everybody has to agree instead of, is this a good solution to the problem? Pretty famous example, in 2003, the United States went to war with Iraq over the issue of Iraq having weapons of mass destruction. And it turned out that they didn't exist, right? As later investigations showed. So there's Colin Powell holding up a model vial of anthrax while giving this presentation to the United Nations Security Council, which was also televised. The whole world was watching. He holds up this little vial of anthrax, scares the hell out of everyone, saying that Iraq has, weapons of mass destruction, including these kinds of bioweapons. And so we have to go take them out, right? Now, at the time, some members of the administration had their doubts. They knew that the claim of weapons of mass destruction was shaky, but they kept that to themselves. They didn't come out and say, actually, we're not sure, right? They didn't want to rock the boat. They didn't want to have fingers pointed at them. They didn't want to be like bad team players, right? They didn't say anything. And the nation went to war. So how do you minimize groupthink? As a leader of a group, you can do some things to minimize groupthink. You can refrain from expressing your opinion at the beginning, right? So, I want you guys to tell me your thoughts without like tipping your hat as to what you are thinking. And the leader can encourage dissent. The leader can say, okay, I want to hear all the reasons why this wouldn't work. Right? And they might even appoint a specific person to have that job. It's called the devil's advocate, right? So, Martin, you're the devil's advocate. Your job is to just try to identify any weaknesses in our solution. You could have an independent expert evaluate the decision your group comes to, right? So after your group has come to some conclusion, you get someone with fresh eyes to look at it and see if they see any problems. You can even do something as simple as hold a follow-up meeting. So once a decision has been made, maybe meet again in 3 days and say, has anything come up? Have you been thinking about this? Any issues come up since we last met? All of these are ways to minimize the chance that everyone's just saying, yes, ma'am, yes, sir. Right? Groupthink. Okay. Moving on to conformity. So when we conform, we're altering our behaviors or our opinions to match those of others or to match what is expected of us. So why do we do this? What makes us conform? According to the model that talks about normative and informational influence, these are the two primary reasons people conform. First up is normative influence. This is when we go along with the group to be liked, to be accepted, to avoid looking foolish, right? So we want to fit in. We don't want to be feeling stupid and vulnerable, right? And then informational influence is when we assume that the way other people is behaving is giving us information about the right way to act, right? So if you're waiting for this bus and everyone's lined up, what do? You get in line, right? You're assuming that all these other people who are in line know something about the process of getting on the bus. Okay, so we want to be liked. We don't want to be foolish. And we assume that other people must know what's going on. So we do what they do. Okay. Solomon Asch, 1955, did some groundbreaking research, providing remarkable evidence of our tendency to conform. So there is a little YouTube clip. I will make that available. You can just even go into Google and go to YouTube and search Asch conformity, and you'll find this clip. But here's what he did. He had a participant in the study show up at the lab at the appointed time, along with 6 other people. So he initially did this at a university. So if you're in his study, you'd show up, you're a student at the school, and 6 other students are showing up at the same time. Okay, so you're all kind of in this room together. The 6 others are already seated. There's one spot for you, so you go and sit at the empty seat. The truth is, the other 6 are in on the study. They're not students, they're researchers. posing as students. So we call that a confederate, someone who's in on the study pretending to be something or someone else. So you're the only real participant, and you're seated at the end of this big long table. And the researcher tells everyone they're going to be judging the lengths of lines. So they'll give you this kind of standard setup. Which of the three test lines, A, B, or C, is the same as the standard line? So you have to look at the three and pick which one is the same. And here's how they get everyone's answer. They pull them individually, person after person. So as you're sitting there, the only real participant, they start at the other end of the table. And they ask the first participant, well, which line's the same as the standard line? Now, the answer is pretty easy, right? The answer is C here. But a weird thing starts to happen. The first person says A. The second person says A. The third person says A. So does the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. And then it comes to you, the only real participant in the study. And this is the study. Are you going to go along with what everyone else said, that the answer is A? Or are you going to stand up for what you know is true and say the answer is C? Right? Will you conform or not? So here's what they found. About 70% of people conformed to the group norm at least once over a dozen trials. So it didn't happen every time, but most people caved at least once over a dozen of these, pick the right line kind of tasks. Okay, so most of us will do it at least some of the time, conform to something that we know isn't true, right? So when and why do people do this? So here's what Ash found. He started to kind of play with this setup. One of the things he played with was, how difficult is this task, right? If he makes the task harder so that it gets harder to tell which of the three lines is the same as the standard line, then people rely more and more on other people's opinions. So as the task becomes ambiguous, harder to figure out, we rely more on what other people are saying. So think about what that means for like jury trials, right? Where there's a lot of ambiguity. It tends to be the case that the jury is going to members of the jury will just be kind of looking at what everyone else is saying. Okay, so ambiguity ramps up conformity. Unanimity is powerful. So people experience great pressure to conform when the group consensus is unanimous. So he started to play with, well, what if, it wasn't the case that all 6 of those other participants were saying, A. What if just one other person, was giving the right answer? So he was playing with that. He found that the size of the majority is important. Conformity grows as the size of the group grows, from 1 to about 3 or 4 members. So that's an interesting finding. He basically found, how many people do you need to be around this table for this conformity effect to occur? You don't need 6 or 10 or 12 people around the table. You need 3 or 4. And you see conformity reach its kind of maximum effect with around 4 people. So that's kind of interesting. And the unanimity thing, if just one other person sitting around that table disagrees with the group, then the real participant will be very likely to also disagree with the group, right? It's like they get their courage up if just one other person bucks the trend. Okay, let me check my timer here. Okay. So social norms, we need rules to function. Conformity is not always a bad thing, right? We would be in chaos if we didn't conform to rules and standards and norms and all that stuff, right? So these are called social norms, the rules that society uses to function. They are expected standards of conduct, like obeying the rules of the road, lining up at a cash register, right? And they influence our behavior in lots of different ways. They tell us which behaviors are appropriate where. They tell us about what will happen if you violate the norm. So this is normative influence, right? You sort of wanting to fit in with the group. So standing in line is a social norm, and people who violate it may get sternly told to get to the back of the line, right? If you've ever tried to cut in line, People don't like that. And you might get some clapback if you try it, right? Another example, tipping at least 15% to wait staff is a social norm. And people who tip less are seen as stingy, right? So that's kind of the punishment for bucking that norm. Peer pressure works this way. It's operating through normative influence, right? So pressure from your peer group around how to behave, how to think, how to act, how to feel, attitudes and opinions. So dissenters are typically not treated well by the group, right? The group doesn't like typically individuals who buck those trends, those patterns. Groups enforce conformity. And people have a need to belong, right? And they worry about being excluded from the group. So that makes group kind of dynamics really powerful in terms of predicting behavior, right? Powerful influence over the members of the group because everybody wants to belong. I'm gonna have to pause here. See you back in a minute. Okay. All right, so social norms operating through normative influence affect our behaviors, right? We want to be seen as good. We want to be accepted by the group. Peer pressure is a great example of something that operates through normative influence. Then there's compliance, the tendency to agree to do things requested by others, right? So when somebody tells you to do something and you do it, you are complying. So there's a number of factors that might increase somebody's tendency to comply. First up is the person's mood. So having someone be in a good mood makes them more likely to comply. If you want to ask your mom for $50, you wait till she's in a good mood, right? Or you try to get her in a good mood, maybe by buttering her up, right? Compliments and things before you ask for the money. Then there are all these strategies, right, for increasing the likelihood that someone will comply with a request. This is stuff that salespeople know about, right? So one is called the foot in the door phenomenon, which is where you start with a small request and then you move to a larger one. Having someone agree to a small ask makes them more likely to agree to a larger ask, right? So for example, a classmate has missed the last psych lecture and asks to borrow your notes, so you give them your notes, right? That's the small ask. Then a week later, they come back and they ask for all of your notes, right? For the year. You're more likely to say yes to this request if you said yes to the smaller request before. It's kind of softened you up. Okay, so that's the foot in the door. The idea is you get your foot in the door if you get them to say yes to a little thing, and then you go in with the big request. Then there's the door in the face strategy, which is kind of the opposite. You start off with the big ask that you know they're going to say no to. So you come in with a request that's bigger than you really want. And then you back off to what you're really asking for. And it seems so much more reasonable now, right? So if you want to borrow $10 from someone, this strategy would be, you go to them and ask for $100. Can I borrow $100? And they're going to say, no, I don't have that kind of money to lend you. And then you say, okay, how about 10? And now 10 feels really reasonable. And they're more likely to say yes than if you had just walked up and asked for 10. Okay, well, if people feel bad saying no, and also that big request sets an anchor for how they're going to perceive what you really want, like a smaller request. Then there's the lowball technique. So this is where you start with a low price or a small request, but then you add on, right? So, car sales often use this sort of strategy. These ads you might get in the mail, payments as low as $99 a month. They have no intention of letting anyone walk away with that deal, right? So if you walked in the door with this thing and said, I want the $99 deal, that's just to get you in the door, right? That's a low ball. And then, oh, well, if you want, seats, you're going to have to pay more. If you want, car mats, you're going to have to pay more, right? So, but by the time you walk out, it's not $99 a month. It's a lot more than that, right? So that's low ball technique. Okay, I'm going to stop here and we'll pick it up with the next video.